My name is Don Jensen. I'm a fellow at the adjunct at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies here in Washington. Also, I work with our host, Sergio Germani in Rome. Thank you for being here today. And let's get started on a very important subject. Mafia groups and international criminal syndicates serve as tools of statecraft, hybrid warfare, self-enrichment in a lot of countries, but perhaps most notably to the Putin regime. KGB intelligence services in particular have a long established connection with the Russian regime, the Russian government, the Russian state, going back to czarist times. And in fact, one of my graduate school professors, Richard Pipes, used to talk about the patrimonial character of Russian politics, where power and money are interlinked. So we want to trace that connection today, especially with relevance to the Putin current Russian state, and talk about what it means for all of us here, for our countries in the West, and what policy recommendations we're most likely to yield some kind of success. In particular, since criminality and organized crime is closely tied to the Russian regime, we like to know as well how it works in practice. Power, who rules, what difference does it make, who rules? All these are questions that are relevant to all of our experts today. But let's turn to them. In this webinar, 6 experts, you know all of them already, I'm sure, will talk about the organized crime link with the Russian intelligence services, its impact on Russian behavior, where it goes from here, and perhaps even what the future holds for Russia, given this hybrid, very interesting, very complex set of relationships. So let's go right to our speakers. You have their list in front of you. I'd like to have each speaker talk for maybe 10 minutes. And at the end of that session, we will then have a Q&A session, allow us to address some of the issues the audience is concerned about. And then finally, Dr. Germani will have a concluding remark at the end of our session in about 90 minutes. So let's begin. Yuri Fostinsky, please, you go first, sir, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you very much. Crime, of course, we know exists everywhere, and by itself, it's not surprising. What's make Russia different is that when perestroika and glasnost started, when market economy started to appear just before the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91, this economy existed without any laws. Basically, the old Soviet laws, of course, could not be applied to market economy at all, while the economy started to be private. And I will give you a very simple example. In the Soviet Union, the operations with hard currency was a crime punishable by death. And at the same time, since approximately 1990, maybe even earlier, the entire economy existed through cash in hard currency. So technically speaking, everybody was committing crime in the Soviet Union prior to '91. There were no laws which were defending business people. The old Soviet laws, again, could not apply. The law enforcement considered all people who were earning money a kind of criminals and never trusted them. And in these conditions, of course, the business community had to look for somebody who would defend them. So some people went to law enforcement, like militia, Ministry of Internal Affairs, and they were using them as the roofs, крышas. Some people went to the FSB, some went to criminals, but everybody was interconnected, because when businesses who have roofs with criminal world have to discuss issues with other businesses who have roofs with the FSB, then people from the FSB, for example, had to talk to people from criminal world. At the end, and this was ironic, you really have difficulties to distinguish between them. And there are famous examples when we sincerely trying to find out, to discover who the person is. Is he a criminal, or is he from law enforcement? And we really do not know the answer. Like let's take Roman Tsepov, for example, who, as he was saying, was colonel of special services. But indeed, it seems to be he was a criminal, and no one actually is able to find out who in reality he was. And there are many examples when people came from criminal world and became famous politicians and business people, or there are examples of business people who became criminals, and that's how interconnected it was. And this situation existed probably, let's say, until 2000, roughly, when Putin became president. What changed is the following. We heard, again, living in 90s, or living through 90s in Russia, we heard about major killings like every day. There were periods in first half of 90s when you would find a banker killed like regularly, because again, criminal world was trying to control banks, and they were killing bankers whom they disapprove. There were godfathers, of course, many of them in the Russian Federation. And it seems to be they were very powerful, and it seems to be that the state could not deal with that. And then suddenly, after 2000, approximately, this changed. We do not really hear about major crimes committed by criminal world in Russia anymore. And the reason why this is happening, because slowly the FSB not just took control of the state, and this again happened in 2000 when Putin became president, but they also took control of the criminal world. Indeed, when you start to investigate what was the relations between those godfathers and the special services, you would find out that those who were recruited by special services, mainly by the FSB, of course, survived. And those who were not recruited or refused to cooperate were basically killed. And again, we remember those periods when we heard that one after another godfather would be killed under unknown circumstances. This was the result of the state trying to take control of criminal world. And by now, I think it's the criminal world as an independent structure doesn't exist. As it exists as a structure which is controlled by the FSB, and again, which is a part of the FSB, because all those people in reality are working with them and working for them. Otherwise, again, they're not allowed to exist. I remember one of my conversations with Alexander Litvinenko, which was very interesting, when I was asking him to explain me, who operates and controls, for example, the narcotics market in Russia, and who is trying to control organized crime in Russia. How does it exist? And he told me, well, it's very simple. You take a particular department of the FSB. For example, you take a department of the FSB which job is to fight organized crime, and then you know that they're actually in charge of organized crime system in the Russian Federation. You take the department which is responsible to fight against illegal drug trade, and then you know that they're in charge of illegal drug trade in the Russian Federation. So it's all reversed. And finally, the department which is supposed to exist to defend Russian democracy is actually the main instrument to destroy Russian democracy. So that's what the FSB was doing, and that's how it was organized. And again, the major political difference is if you compare it with pre-1991 period, that in the Soviet Union, of course, the KGB was the most powerful special service institution in the world with the largest budget in the world. But at least it existed under political control of the Communist Party, and it had budget from the Communist Party, received from the Communist Party. But after 1991, slowly this situation changed, and by 2000, the FSB actually took control of the entire state. They do not have any political control now. There is no one who is above them. And instead of budget, which they were receiving from the Communist Party, they now have the entire economy of the Russian Federation as the budget for the activity of the FSB. And that's what changed, of course. And that's why we do not hear about organized crime anymore. We do not really hear about, major criminal groups fighting with each other, because again, by now, everything is under control of the state, and the state is the FSB. So that's why that's what's make Russian situation different from, I guess, everything we know about the organized crime, including organized crime in countries like Italy or in Latin America.
Thank you. You're very fascinating. Thank you. And now we will turn to, I think, Anastasia.
Yes, hello. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. This subject is understudied, in my opinion. So I started to learn about the Russian organized crime 15 years ago. I copied St. Petersburg criminal files. At that time, this one just example of really impressive nexus between organized crime and the intelligence services, but not only with the intelligence, also GUVD, Russian Interior Ministry, was involved. In St. Petersburg in the 90s, when mobsters were arrested, some of members of the famous Tambovskaya gang, they were acting policemen, and one of them used service guns to do raid attacks in St. Petersburg. But I would like to show some slides. Maybe we have the first one, please. Yeah, here we can see Russian mobsters: Gafur Rahimov, Semyon Mogilevich, Sergei Mikhailov, alias Mikhais, Alexander Averin, alias Avera. Officially, as it was mentioned, they are invisible. They don't exist in Russian media, for example, but they are billionaire. One of them, the famous Mikhais, is receiving a medal and a watch from Putin. So I saw a version in Russian press. Maybe Putin does not know about this decoration of Mikhais, but I doubt it. So the second slide, please. Yes, do we have proofs of this cooperation between security services and organized crime? In fact, yes. There are some academic researches, and also I was very impressed to read a leaked report. This is a Swiss intelligence report from 2007. It is called like cooperation between organized crime and intelligence of the Commonwealth of Independent States, so of Russia. So the Swiss intelligence, who has money, I suppose, because I didn't see such a report of FBI, for example. They say that some of the colleagues speak even about symbiosis. But anyway, in many cases, organized crime and the FSB works together. When did it start? So according to this Swiss analytical report, it started in 1930s. So in Soviet Union, because KGB needed to control political prisoners, so they started to cooperate with mobsters. There's some more interesting thoughts, but you will find it. I will share the presentation and the link. But I was even more impressed by another researchers, academic researchers. For example, Marina Salye. She was Putin's first enemy. She discovered a huge corruption scheme involving Putin and other Chekists in 1992. So she wrote a book, and she says that the prohibition in the 80s, so during Gorbachev era, contributed a lot to this prosperity of organized crime. It was like the prohibition in Chicago during Al Capone era. So when underground network was already formed, then the prohibition was cancelled, but this underground network was already there, and they started to do different things, not only vodka. And more generally, the Soviet system with underground economy, it was really profitable for organized crime, for the prosperity of organized crime afterwards. So, but then I would like to speak what I discovered. For example, I found a document how already in 89, a Putin's dacha neighbor, he's of course a high-rank KGB officer, he registered an offshore Soviet Liechtenstein offshore. And then this offshore joint SPAC, the company, this is joint venture between basically organized crime and FSB. It became famous in 2003. It was listed in Germany for money laundering. More generally, it appears that the Communist Party money, even from the banks abroad and from within the country, it was diverted to private banks. For example, precisely to Bank Russia. Putin pretended, but yeah, so to Putin, in the year 2000, when Putin came to power, he said all the propaganda was saying, Putin's friends are repeating until now, that Putin saved us from the organized crime. But now we have enough evidence to say Putin is linked to organized crime. The mobsters, who were killing people, who were doing raid attacks, who took illegal control of the companies, they were major shareholders, not minor, but major shareholders of this Bank Russia, together with Putin's neighbors of his dacha. or they were also neighbors in St. Petersburg luxury apartment house. And there are many others examples. So now I started to think maybe Putin, he is like a pyromaniac fireman, basically. So he says he saved us, but at least he contributed to this organized crime, of course, together with other FSB people. So the second slide, next one, the third one. This is just a fine example of the past. Putin was responsible to create municipal casinos, as we can see in official documentation of St. Petersburg when Putin was vice mayor. And those casinos were run, surprised, by organized crime. So we have pictures, testimonies, documents. Next slide, please. This is the famous memo of Alexander Litvinenko. He met with Putin in 98, and he was alerting Putin on how dangerous it was, this penetration of organized crime to FSB. And to my opinion, the scheme is still reliable in many cases. So we can see different crime groups, famous Podolskaya, Izmailovskaya, Solntsevskaya, to which FSB officers they were connected, or also to other law enforcement agencies. Next, please. This is not, well, I would not stop on this. Maybe people who want will read it carefully afterwards. I would like the next slide, please. Yes, I'm often asked the question, okay, it was in the past, the 90s, but now what proofs do we have that the organized crime still exists in Russia, and how relevant is it? So just a few examples. It's not an exhaustive list. In Russian diplomatic pouch, drugs were found. The trial was in Argentina in 2018. The origin of drug was Colombia, and it was intended normally to Netherlands, because also some skeptic people says, but it's not Russia now the hub of drugs, but it's in the Netherlands. Yes, and I agree, it's international. Our State Duma deputy, Russian State Duma deputy, is officially under US sanctions for drug trafficking with Central Asia. I investigated a little bit on it, so I found that a criminal authority used to live in Kadyrov's residency. So the explanation of it was the organized crime is taking place anyway. So why not to control it for Kadyrov? But I think we can apply the same principle to the whole Putin system to justify the situation. They say it is taking place anyway, and we just control. So in FinCEN leaks, we discovered that billions of Semyon Mogilevich, crime lords, were found in UK banks. And there are other examples. I was heard, for example, that the famous scheme which operated in Monaco of money laundering from oil from St. Petersburg, now it's operating through Dubai, but the company is within the same network of between Liechtenstein, Monaco, and Dubai. And let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So why is it so important? Just to give you an example, here in France, we have a famous historian. She was advisor even to Mitterrand and then to other presidents. She said, FSB, okay, FSB is running Russia, but it is just as a French school of administration. Let's live with it. The problem is exactly those links of FSB with the crime, which make them very dangerous. Organized crime, it's not like in Italy. In Italy, the state, the police is combating it. In Russia, Russian state protects organized crime. Just to give some concrete examples for the war in Ukraine, there was a scam called Rosukrenergo company, and Bill Browder, he even before the affair of Magnitsky, he was doing some activism against Gazprom, and he calculated that this scam allowed to siphon 478 million US dollars a year, and it lasted many years. This scam was shut down completely only after Euromaidan in Ukraine. So I think such businesses shut down in such businesses was one of the reason of the invasion. So I like the example, for example, of Alexander Bastrykin. He's officially investigative committee's chief of Russia. He was appointed to his position by Tambovskaya gang authority. We have wiretapes on that. And now this Bastrykin, he opened dozens of fake probes against Ukrainian Nazis. And when we read the website of this investigative committee, we find like 10 new probes every day. So against this so-called investigator, there is such compromise that apparently he obeys to every wish of Putin, and this is why he is such a servant. So, what do you think about the quotation of Victor Bout, arms trafficker freed from U.S. prison? So we need to win this war with the Satanists, etc. So Victor Bout is speaking on Russian television. This is from open sources. I already said that I was looking into organized crime since many years, and when the war started, I just looked at what they were doing, and of course, what a surprise! Everybody was supporting this war, and they are not ready to finish it. So I think I'm done.
Very much.
All right.
Next in line, we have Olga, and then we'll go to Dina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me for this important discussion. I work on Russia's hybrid warfare and all the operations that they carry out to subvert democracies around the globe, and specifically all the tools that they use, from disinformation to cyber attacks to money laundering, organized crime, the Russian Orthodox Church, and on and on and on. Russia's organized crime. First, it could be traced to the KGB close to the collapse of the Soviet Union. As the Soviet Union was collapsing, Anastasia mentioned the Simon Mogilevich. He was moving money out of Russia for the KGB and storing it, offshore. Along with a business partner who in Canada, this guy Bernstein. So they started moving out when they saw that the Soviet Union, saw that there were signs with the Soviet Union towards the end. And then after the Soviet Union collapsed, you have Western, businessmen and Western governments coming into Russia, bringing loads of money to help to rebuild Russia. And what happened is at that time that the FSB, organized crime, and the Kremlin, I mean, this money was going to them. And this is basically, how the kleptocracy and the mafia state begins in the 90s. I work a lot on Russia's organized crime as far as how the Russian intelligence is basically an arm of Russian intelligence. One, to carry out operations where the Russian state wants to have plausible deniability. So, for instance, Semyon Mogilevich was involved in arms trafficking to Al Qaeda. Russia obviously was behind this, but they used a cutout like Semyon Mogilevich to basically have the plausible deniability that this is just a criminal. And then you see them interfering basically in elections, compromising officials. And I want to focus now with the upcoming US election on our Republican candidate, Donald Trump. I investigated him a decade ago, and he basically made the majority of his money from Russia's organized crime. His first dealings were in the early 80s, where he took $6 million of cash, in a suitcase to sell a few apartments. And then it continued. And all the people around him pretty much went back to Mogilevich. And also in the 90s, we had Oleg Deripaska, who was rising under the roof of Russia's organized crime during the wars. And he eventually hired Paul Manafort, who was Trump's campaign manager, who Trump himself has known since 1980. So you have an injection of millions of tens of millions of dollars over decades going through real estate properties in the US and offshore. And this is just, one of the things. And then we see, for instance, with Oleg Deripaska, he comes back during the 2016 election. And again, this is an individual who basically came through the arms of organized crime. And he was collecting our data, campaign polling data, from the Trump campaign, handing it went to Manafort. Manafort handed it to him via a GRU agent, Kalimnik. And then this makes its way back to Russia's intelligence services to study literally a few months before our 2016 election. Then you have also a lot of business, men and oligarchs who basically were seen, and did business with American companies, with European companies, and were seen as actual businessmen. But again, there is a very, very thin line between Russia's intelligence services, Russia's Russian mafia, Russian oligarchs, and the Kremlin. They're all intertwined. They all carry out operations when need be. And you have people like Mikhail Friedman and Peter Avin, who also came through the ranks of Russian mafia under the cover of FSB. And then, along with Oleg Deripaska, and then later on you see them across Europe, holding yacht parties, compromising politicians, co-opting, former defense officials, and basically anyone who had influence. And at the same time, you have the Russian mafia aspect of it. Again, this is an attack on democracy, and they inject corruption into our Western institutions, co-opt, Westerners who become their enablers, and all this corruption ends up weakening, our institutions, and this is why you see even, across Europe that some countries have had a softer response when it comes to Russia. When it comes to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And then you have another figure. Well, let me finish with Trump. Anastasia had a slide with two mafia, Vorzakon, who are mafia, bosses, who Taiwan chick, whose name is Toktahuanov, and Yapon chick, who is Ivanov. Ivanov. Ivanov came to the U.S. in the early 90s, came under FBI investigation not too long after. He was laundering money for the Russian mafia, also an associate of Mogilevich. And when the FBI caught him, he was caught in Trump Towers when they arrested him. He was laundering money through casinos in New Jersey. And then Taiwanchik had a international basically bribery ring running through Trump Tower in the 2000s via his associates in who were living in Trump Tower. Eventually, that ring was busted. The FBI, arrested whoever didn't flee the U.S. But that just shows you how interconnected all of this is. And then you have another case where you have Gennady Petrov. He's a mob boss in Spain. He was connected. Putin, a few years back, appointed this guy, Sergei Korolev, who was the first deputy of FSB, which is the security services. And he was directly connected to Gennady Petrov. And, from back in the day and some of their operations. And then you have the same Gennady Petrov, who directly ties to Nikolai Patrushev, who's a former FSB head in the late 90s, and then, sits on the Security Council. And Medvedev, the former president and prime minister, when Putin decided to do a swap, who also connects to Petrov. And what happened in Spain is that not only were they gathering intelligence and laundering money, they also were co-opting people, and Russia was collecting information on what eventually would be the attempt for Catalonia secession, which Russia then at that end, when the secession took place, they had sent a few GRU agents in order to assist. Luckily, it didn't go through, but again, it just shows you how intertwined these operations are. So unlike with Italian mafia, where they, basically bribe and co-opt politicians and police officers, prosecutors, in order so they can make their own profits. They also with Russian mafia, they not only carry out the corrupt dealings, but then this information goes back to security services, and later on, when security services sees it's necessary to use this information against Westerners, then you have, then they pull this information out and have compromise basically hanging over these people's head. And that's why, with Russian organized crime, you see it operating across the whole globe. And lastly, I'll mention with going back to Mogilevich, our colleague Anastasia did an incredible investigation several years ago on how Mogilevich, when he left the Soviet Union, he moved to Israel, set up a base there, eventually made his way to Hungary, and basically how Viktor Orban was compromised by him because he was taking kickbacks to allow Mogilevich's operations to carry on in Hungary. And then you see now, fast forward to today, you have Orban basically working through the far right across Europe, in the United States, and very heavily involved, with institutions like the Heritage Foundation and others in the US who are supporting extreme far right policies and far right, basically extremists. So this is how you see, it pretty much is overlaps in every which way, whether it's Russia's oligarchs or Russia's organized crime members, or intelligence services in the Kremlin itself.
Okay, thank you, Olga. If I could ask speakers to stay away from U.S. presidential politics, that would be great. Now we go to Dina.
Thank you very much. I thank you for having me on this very important panel. And in my talk, I will try to give some elements of the answer to the question why organized crime in Putin's system is so intertwined with власть, why it's the core of how power is working in Russia. So I argue that the unprocessed and perverted memory of terror enabled Putin's clique to continue the Bolshevik tradition of a mafia state founded by criminals. To my mind, this constitutes the most significant continuity between the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia, even though I think that Putinism has grown into a criminal regime of a new type. The Kremlin successfully instrumentalizes and exploits the memory of terror, which develops on two interrelated levels, social and mnemonic. On the social level, this historical memory of Zona, the Soviet and post-Soviet camps and prison system, instructs the social matrix of post-Soviet society. On the mnemonic level, it informs the Kremlin's memory politics and post-Soviet memory of the perpetrator. Let me start with the most obvious, the social level. The zona, as you all know, was an organic feature of Soviet socialism and an integral experience for generations of Soviet and post-Soviet people. Not by chance did inmates, the prisoners, the zeki, called the Soviet world outside the camps the big zona. From the inception of the Gulag, Bolshevik policy was to put political prisoners together with hardened criminals, who were allowed to impose their criminal norms on the rest of the prisoners. The criminal past of the leaders of both regimes has made them considered career criminals, their social proxies. And during the Soviet century, as Moshe Levin aptly called it, the Soviet zone generated caste-like social relations. Political prisoners occupied the longest run of this caste society, and this practice remains current in post-Soviet Russia. Under Putin's rule, the zone has openly evolved into the dominant network of social relations. Among its most important features are not only corruption, mafia state social networks, but also the normalization of a quasi-caste social organization. Putinism is a social system that openly relies on new forms of social inequality, among which modern slavery plays an important role. Modern slavery penetrates many aspects of post-Soviet life and impacts the entire society. It's very visible that in the last 2 decades, Russian attitudes to slavery and serfdom have undergone a very significant transformation. Despite de facto slavery in the camps and the quasi-serfdom of peasants, the Soviet official ideology condemned Tsarist serfdom and slavery as social evils due to the Marxist claim about the liberation of the exploited. In post-Soviet Russia, tolerance, social acceptance, and even approval of slavery and the caste society have become a new normal. Several influential political movements and politicians openly advocate for them for example, in the Izborsky Club, and they can talk about other leaders later on in this respect, if you're interested. Russian support for the terror-ridden system and imperialist politics, such as the war against Ukraine, stems from the social transformation. This criminal social system and Putin's criminal regime are sustained by a specific memory politics. This memory politics consists of two trends: re-Stalinization, meaning, uh, uh, well, it's kind of self-evident, bringing the idea that Stalin's regime was a good one back again, and neo-medievalism, namely the celebration of the Russian Middle Ages and its society of a state as a social system and an alternative to democracy. Those intimately interrelated trends glorify two instances of historical state terror: the Oprichnina, Ivan the Terrible terror, and Stalinism. Since re-Stalinization is much better known in research, I will focus on neo-medieval politics, which is much less in the focus of the observers and scholars. Neo-medieval politics, memory politics, promotes the idea that state terror is the best form of governance for Russian, and that it should be reintroduced again. It revives the myth of Russia as a messianic nation in its most xenophobic and anti-Semite form, and calls for the rebuilding of the Russian Empire. It promotes, without generalizing in any abstract terms and using only pseudo-historical examples, social inequality, personal dependence, and monarchy as organic historic forms of Russian social organization, making democracy look like a Western aberration. Let me give you just a couple of examples because we are short of time here. So the favorite hero of medieval memory politics is Ivan the Terrible. As his name suggests, this Russian 16th century Tsar is best remembered for establishing for the first time in Russian history a regime of state terror that is called Oprichnina. So there were no monuments to this Tsar in the entire Russian history since 16th century until 2016, when the first monument to him was unveiled in a row, and this monument was followed by three other monuments in Cheboksary, another in Moscow and Alexandrova, there it was moved to, and three more monuments were planned. Even his grandfather, Ivan III, also got a monument in 2017. To give you just an idea how much the Tsar is dear to Putin and his clique, from 2009 to 2023, 14 films and TV series popularizing Ivan the Terrible were produced either directly sponsored by the Russian state or financed by Kremlin proxies. All of them are shown on Russia state channel, like Canal Россия, for example. And other medieval lords also have not also been forgotten. You all remember the monument to Prince Vladimir unveiled in 2016 on Red Square in Moscow. But the importance of this monumental, political importance of this monumental frenzy is best reflected in the occupied territories of Ukraine. In August 2022, Russian occupiers demolished a monument to the Ukrainian defenders in the city of Mariupol, and soon after that, they put in place a statue of Alexander Nevsky, another Russian medieval prince. Shortly before that, the Russian website Regnum published an article that favorably compared Putin to his medieval predecessor. On November 21st, 2022, a monument to Prince Igor, another medieval Russian prince, was unveiled in occupied Lugansk. Igor is a symbolic figure, as you all know, of Russian nationalism. Just to give you another idea of the scale of this new medieval propaganda, over the past 10 years, 266 films and TV episodes financed by Kremlin, all their proxies, were shown in Russian prime time. This amounts to 21, almost 22 films and TV series per year and two per month. This memory politics is supported by a specific memory regime rooted in the right-wing authoritarian populism, which I term the memory of the perpetrators. It seeks to undermine the victim-centered memory culture, the cosmopolitan memory, that was formed in the West largely around memories of the Holocaust. Post-Soviet Russia represents an extreme case of this emerging memory regime. It's rooted in their politics that denies historical responsibility for any crimes committed by Russia, including the Soviet crimes, and is reinforced by the far-right tendentious uses of history worldwide. Uh, Soviets have never acknowledged the criminal nature of their secret services. And as you all know, Putinism is based on the preeminence of secret services in governmental structures. By blaming Stalin's crimes on the cult of personality, Nikita Khrushchev made the subsequent glorification of their apparatus less controversial than it might otherwise have been. Under Putin, the celebration of secret services reemerged after the public exposure of its crimes during glasnost and perestroika in Russia. Uh, Putinism offers an example of ideology being replaced with memory politics. And here I agree with Dr. Felshtinsky that modern Russia is a state without ideology. The desire, coupled with an ability to formulate a new forward-looking ideology as a system of abstract principles, has been acutely felt by Putinists. The national security strategy, updated in 2021, called for developing an attractive ideological foundations of the future world order. Alexander Dugin, an infamous leader of Neo-Eurasian movement and one of their uh, big fans of idea that Russia should go back to the Middle Ages, seconded this by proposing the creation of Putinism, a new ideology, as he called it, that will, he believes, help in rectifying Russia's military failures in Ukraine. Under Soviets, Putin's regime, unlike Soviets, Putin's regime has no ideology and hence no vision of the future, which is why the Kremlin wants to turn time backwards and seek an ideal society in the historical past, be it the 16th century Tsardom or its oppression terror or Stalinism. Now, I would like to conclude by saying, just by addressing the question, why uh, this, how the West can deal with it. And admitting the uncomfortable truth about Putin's criminal nature is challenging for the West because it would require halting business as usual attitude and practices. Even the war against Ukraine has not entirely stopped it. This is why Putin's corruption has been spreading so rapidly and with so much impunity, acquiring many Western public voices among academics and journalists. And since no one is trying to stop them, they carry on their Kremlin's assignments. Of course, there are also useful idiots, but they're a much more rare commodity nowadays than during Stalin times. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dina. Great presentations. We have about 20 minutes for questions, and there are some interesting questions as well on the
Yes.
chat.
Can I make these?
Please, Sergio.
No, I'm not going to express any conclusions. I'll just to kick off the discussion. I'll just ask two questions. First of all, whether organized crime today, as Yuri said, in Russia is no longer an autonomous force as it was during the 1990s, where you had very powerful groups like the Mogilevich group, the Solnsevsky group, the Tambov group in St. Petersburg. So is it that these groups are now under the total control of the FSB, but they still exist? They still do their trafficking. They still control some areas of Russia, but they're just simply under the control, the total control. Because some people say that maybe there is a kind of bargaining that yes, the services are the senior partner in this partnership, but still organized crime has power in Russia. It has not been rendered completely powerless or just a pure tool of organized crime. This is one question. The other question is about international drug trafficking, because both Yuri, I know, and Anastasia have worked on this topic. In Yuri's book, there is a chapter on drug trafficking from Afghanistan the 1980s as a state-sponsored operation in order to weaken the West. This is something that several analysts were saying at that time, although it was rather ignored in mainstream analysis. And now it appears that there are investigative reporters and other analysts that say that today Russia is also sponsoring drug trafficking, for example, from South America, from South American drug-producing areas toward Europe. There was this famous case of the Argentinian embassy, of the Russian embassy in Buenos Aires. There are also allegations that some Russian influence structures in South America are involved in drug trafficking and connected to Mexican and Colombian drug cartels. This is the other question. So this is I would end here, and we can take the questions. If you have any trouble with chat, we have several questions on the chat, but you can also send them by WhatsApp or by the email that you see here. And okay, thank you.
Could I start to answer, and then I'm sure Anastasia and Olga would continue to answer both of your questions. Could I start? Am I connected?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Well, we mentioned Mogilevich several times, right? But he's not the only one. And indeed, there are people whom we know quite well who are connected with both the organized crime and the special services or the FSB, and work for both organized crime and the FSB. Let's take, for example, Jorge Ahmed Nukhaev, a famous Chechen gangster and at the same time a high-level FSB operative, probably a general. We mentioned some other people as well, but let's take Kadyrov, who is actually a politician, but at the same time committing obvious crimes in Chechnya and is controlling organized crime in Chechnya. But, well, let's take, I remember you asked not to mention elections, I won't, but let's take the purchase of Donald Trump villa by Dmitry Rybolovlev, who is a, questionable businessman, becoming a major businessman after spending months in prison and after being connected to local organized crime, but at the same time, who is partner of both General Yezubchenko from the FSB and Yuri Trutnev from Kremlin. And then I think the well-known case now is, of course, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is a criminal who was spending years in Russian prison and colonies for crimes committed, and then became a person very close to Putin, and at the same time, continued to be a criminal. And so these examples, I think, indicate quite well that both crime and power in Russia are interconnected. And the biggest crime in the criminal world in Russia, the biggest bosses of criminal world in Russia are interconnected with the high-level politicians in Russia, and they work together. They're part of the state. They're part of the state economy, and they actually have the same goals. I'm sure there are no contradictions between goals both political and influential and economic goals, which Putin has, and the bosses of Russian criminal world so that's what the problem in Russia is, that it's so deeply interconnected that it's impossible to separate them.
May I continue?
Please.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I saw an interesting question in the chat. Do we have evidence about connections between Italian mafia and Russian mafia and other mafias? I saw a publication, it was in the 90s, that there was even a congress between Russian and Italian Sicilian mafia where they spoke about the cooperation. As for actual situation, I was contacted by a journalist investigating Corsica, Corsica's mafia cooperating with Kemerovo. Kemerovo, you know, it's in Siberia, 40,000 kilometers from Moscow. So somehow that they worked together. So everything is interconnected. I like the classification of Leonid Reutemann. This is the former killer of Sontsevo gang, who is in US and cooperating with FBI. So he says that there were in Russia there were four major criminal syndicates: Sontsevo, Podolskaya, Izmailovskaya, and the Chechens, and others were cooperating with the most powerful ones. For example, Tambov gang, they were cooperating with Sontsevo. And indeed, we can now even watch the video of birthday of Vladimir Kumarin, who is crime lord of Tambovskaya gang, and who is there, Luke Mogilevich. So it's like a world ocean, right? They are separated, but there is a lot of cooperation. Sergio, you asked about drug trafficking. I know this is the subject, and indeed investigative journalists are trying to look at Russian trail in Latin America. What I can say, I followed the trial of this cocaine in the diplomatic pouch of Russia. It was online because of coronavirus, so I watched it, and at least the witnesses were saying that this is a systematic practice. Of course, it's not only about 400 kilos of cocaine in this concrete case. And even in the 90s, we have some famous stories of cocaine involving some people like Kumarin. But when I was hearing two wild tapes of Gennady Petrov, mentioned by Olga, Gennady Petrov, so the mobster from St. Petersburg, caught in Spain, officially he has nothing to do with Latin America. And still, there are conversations about his top connections in Argentina and Brasilia. And one conversation, it was extremely interesting. So Petrov was asking something. It may be interpreted in the sense that the FSB was doing it itself through the ports, and that the organized crime was like the lower partner in this cooperation. So I can see, last remark, I can see some comments in the sense that the West is doing nothing against this organized crime. In fact, the problem is the famous rule of law. So far, almost all the crime lords caught in Europe were released and acquitted. Everybody can read the sentence, the acquittal of Spanish mobsters. So the Spanish judge saying the FSB told us, the FSB of St. Petersburg sent us a letter saying that they are honest people. So yes, we can see strange economic transactions, but we don't know origin of the money. Or Russia has nothing to reproach to its citizens, so we acquit them. The same way it happened in Switzerland as for Sergei Mikhailov, and it's an extremely worrying situation. The only thing we can do is to raise awareness, even with public articles, speeches, etc. Because in fact, the prosecutors in the West, they can use even the evidence of anti-corruption activists, etc. If they understand, if they want to do it, because to trust Russian prosecution saying that there is no crime, no criminality, as they say, it's just inadmissible in contemporary world.
Thank you. There are a number of absolutely fascinating questions in the chat. I'll hold one of my own for a bit later, but one of the people in the audience asked about organized crime and the internet. And to be honest, I've never thought of that before, but will one of our four distinguished panelists please enlighten us if they know something about that? Is organized crime involved in the internet, or let's say cyber, and ways that we know of? Oh, Olga, you're volunteering. Thank you.
I am volunteering, and I actually want to go back to the Italian mafia and Russia connection before I go there. So interestingly enough, it looks like the roots of the connection began in the 1970s in the U.S., in Brighton Beach, where I grew up. And basically what happened is that the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was signed, and the Kremlin released a lot of Soviet Jews out. And with that, they released a lot of KGB agents and Trojan horses, people from prison, the worst criminals and whatnot. So when they got to Brighton Beach, they basically started setting up the Russian mafia. And a lot of them arrived 75, 76, 77. By 70, I would say 6, 7, you already see them beginning to work with the five families. And they pulled off some of the biggest scams in New York you could think of, between later on Bank of New York, earlier on the gasoline scam in Brooklyn, which was a tax evasion scam worth millions. And for the most part, they, interestingly enough, the Russian criminals who at that time arrived, they learned some of their structure, or at least in operational terms, from the Italian mafia, the five families in New York. So that's where it began. And then eventually you had the local Brighton Beach members going to Pennsylvania, to Florida, California, and then Italy, and you kind of see it, start with Brighton Beach as ground zero, and then by the 90s, it's pretty much across all of Europe, even to the point that the local mafia people were trafficking heroin, one of the biggest traffickers of heroin into the U.S., and at the same time selling Soviet nuclear submarines. I mean, this just shows you the interconnection, and they were connected back again to Russian security services. And as far as cyber criminals, our Department of Justice constantly, indicts cyber criminal groups for like the SolarWinds hack, the ransomware attacks, the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. And, they attribute it to private criminals and private hackers. There's no such thing as a private hacker inside of Russia. I mean, anyone who is hacking Colonial Pipeline or the Pentagon or other, U.S. agencies, they are working with the GRU or the FSB, depending, which unit they split it up. So there's a lot of interconnection, but these private, again, Russia uses plausible deniability. So they have this whole like REvil, which then I think turned to Dark Evil, and other groups that they keep separate as private criminals. These people are stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from the proceeds from their cyber attacks. This is all connected to mafia inside of Russia. So again, you have this nexus of Russian organized crime with Russian intelligence services with cyber attacks.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have seen an interesting question in the chat which I would like to address. This is the question about anti-Semitism in Putin's Russia, because as we all know, Putin kind of tried to sort of demonstrate at some point that he is not an anti-Semite. But since the war in Ukraine started, it just his anti-Semitism got out of control. It's not only about their Dagestani who blocked and the airport in Makhachkala and harassed Jewish people there, and their very light punishment, just basically ignorance they received as a response of their authorities. I think the most important kind of gesture, the recent gesture of Putin's anti-Semitism, it's not only his statements about Zelensky and Zelensky nationality. He just cannot pass on this. He is constantly kind of talking about Zelensky being a Jew, and at the same time accusing Zelensky of Holocaust and God knows what else, and of being a Nazi. But I think the most important sign is that on October 26th, Hamas leaders, right after their horrible pogrom they did in Israel, Hamas leaders came to Moscow, and together with their Iranian vice minister for foreign affairs, I believe, and were received by high Russian officials. I mean, Putin tried, and I think it was much linked to actually Alexander Dugin's new Eurasian project. He tried to play sort of imperial card insofar as kind of national question is concerned. He tried to present himself as someone for whom, all people living in Russia are kind of more or less equal. But this didn't last for long, of course. And I think uh, we see currently what's going on, and unfortunately, I'm afraid that anti-Semitism will be on the rise in Russia.
I just wanted to add something to this. Shortly after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I monitor Russian news and media, and chatter on Telegram, and there were several prominent, journalists inside of Russia who were making comments somewhat, that was not in line with the state and kind of showing that they are against the war. And Russian propagandists pretty much put them as targets, but they put them as targets using their names, saying these are Jews. That's what they have in common. As a result, all these journalists, one after another, were receiving like on their door to their house. They there was like a Nazi, not a Nazi, a Ukrainian emblem labeled with Nazis, like put on their door, and a severed pig's head put on in front of their door. So this began like shortly after the full-scale invasion. And the other thing I want to point out, I actually wrote an article for SIPA a few years ago on the connection with Russia, Hamas, Hezbollah, going back to Soviet days, because that relationship started in the late 80s, and pretty much, how they how it's worked since then. And with the October 7th attack, Hamas, that received a lot of, used funding for their operation, they put it through a Russian cryptocurrency exchange called Garantex, where this is how they, the money went through there and then eventually moved to Hamas. So again, there is a lot of interconnection. That, and lastly, I'll say that for the past decade, Russia has assisted Assad in murdering more than close to 750,000 Syrians, depending, each Syrian organization, they have an approximate count. Russia, IRGC, and Hezbollah were working together, but so closely that they had joint centers in Iraq, in Syria, sharing intelligence in order to help Assad, quell the protest and to go after Syrian opposition.
Yeah, I think it's yeah. Thank you. It's very important. I think it goes back to Primakov and his operations in the Middle East.
Thank you. I want to switch a little bit to the topic of the Ukraine war and ask you about what people here in Washington sometimes call horizontal escalation, which is to say, the threats are not necessarily vertical in terms of nuclear use, but the fostering by the Kremlin of sabotage, other blowing up things. We saw incidents at the Paris Olympics and so forth. And that in response to sanctions, the Kremlin has relied more on organized crime groups to strike back rather than less. And I wanted to ask any of the four of you if you've heard anything to add about that topic. It's a very interesting thing, very difficult to get a handle on. Olga, I see you nodding.
Russia, actually, they've been escalating their sabotage attacks across Europe, and also, by the way, explosions, assassination attempts, poisoning people, who are speaking out, and they really have a very specific program right now to go after people speaking out against them in Europe and U.S. But yeah, it's interesting because Russia shifted. After the full-scale invasion, finally, European security services started coordinating and exposing the spy networks. And God knows, I mean, they're countless, but they started exposing the spy networks and expelling a lot of diplomats, a lot of, other Russian agents. And I mean, it was in the most movie-like operations of how they were capturing, arresting, exposing, and with that showing how these people, they were handlers to people in Germany and UK and whatnot. After that, they took a blow because they a lot of their networks were fractured. At the same time, they started refilling the pool because towards the end of 22, when Russia announced, the mobilization, close to 1 million Russians escaped, and both European and U.S. intelligence services said that they sent out a lot of FSB and SVR and GRU agents in that wave. But again, that takes time to cultivate. So what they started doing is shifting over to via Telegram, shifting over to recruiting, hiring local thugs in countries, paying them, pennies to basically go blow this up, go over here, sabotage this. And you see this happening everywhere. I mean, it's across Finland, it's across Norway, Poland, pretty much everywhere. And it's basically a problem. Hopefully, with the arrest of Durov in France, that French intelligence will be able to get a handle of what's happening on this Telegram and kind of be able to tamp down that.
Thank you very much.
FSB, Federal Security
Go ahead,
Services.
please. Go ahead.
No, someone asked what FSB is. It's Russia's Federal Security Services, which is basically equivalent to US FBI, I guess, in the closest equivalence.
Thank you. We are about out of time. We have 10 minutes to go, and I'm turning the floor over to our hosts and Dr. Germani for a concluding word or two.
Well, we still have 10 minutes if you want to address, for example, Sanshiro Hosaka, who is an expert analyst on the Russian security services, asks whether FSB Deputy Director Karalyov in the 1990s worked for a private security company for Serdyukov, who later became the defense minister. Do you think that this was his own private initiative to go and work in this company, or he was seconded by the FSB to go there, as a strategy to penetrate the private sector in those years?
Yeah, thank you, Sergio. I was trying to answer the question by writing, but I failed. I think yes, it is an interesting question. It was not probably his private initiative. Serdyukov was remembered in St. Petersburg like really one of the mobsters back then. It was confirmed by city council members to me. They were like special sports like, well, they were visible, but also Kumarin was visiting city hall like Serdyukov at this time when Putin was vice mayor. So in fact, Serdyukov was caught finally with a gun, and he was told by the police, it's not a problem at all. You should write that you found it on the street, so you surrender, and that's all. You are free. And the famous Serdyukov was officially our former defense minister, by the way, very linked to Tambov gang. In the 90s, he was running officially some furniture shop. So it appears that this furniture shop was taken illegally from the previous owners. And then, indeed, this Korolev started to work with them. Who was the chief in this structure? It's a disputable question. Now Serdyukov, so Korolev became FSB deputy director, and according to Ukrainian journalists, he was responsible for assassination attempts on Kirill Budanov, who is chief investigator, chief intelligence service in Ukraine, also Zelensky, and also the head of security services of Ukraine, SBU. This is not bad, right? But as for Serdyukov, he is forgotten, but he is having a top position within Chemezov, Sergei Chemezov, another Putin's KGB mate. They were at KGB together in Eastern Germany. So everybody there and supporting the war. Again, to the initial question, FSB was infiltrating crime gangs in the 90s. In the famous Spanish trial mentioned already here in 2018, a Spanish lawyer in evidence that Gennady Petrov was a KGB agent and that Putin had a lawyer rank, and then this KGB, and this lawyer was trying to say, Petrov and Putin met at KGB. So what? And this is how insolent they are.
Okay.
Couple words about interconnection. There is a recent documentary about Kadyrov which claims, I think with evidence, that drug trafficking from South America is actually controlled by Valentina Matvienko. Andrei Lugovoy, who is, of course, a person who participated in the murder of Litvinenko, is in charge of cryptocurrency market in Russia. Literally, all operations in cryptocurrency go through him. That's how it's interconnected. I mean, these are all major businesses, and it's either high-level officials or the FSB or criminal worlds, and they all work together and they're partners.
I just want to add a final word. That the Western analysts and Western governments are making a very big mistake because they all focus on this as Putin's Russia, and that he created this. A lot of this, yes, under him, you had interconnection. Well, prior to Putin getting to the scene while he was in St. Petersburg, you already had these existing interconnections between FSB, organized crime, in the early 90s. And the thing is that it's part of the system. And, people specifically blame him and his regime for this, where this is something that's goes back, and it's the same thing with like Wagner, the terrorist organization. I mean, they use identical tactics to what mercenaries did during the Soviet-Afghan wars. It is all the same tactics and tools, just a new face on the Kremlin. And the only time that there was semi a drop of hope for democracy was after the collapse. But unfortunately, way too quickly, there was just too much money injected into Russia and too much of FSB, the security services, and organized crime, trying to steal the nation's resources and build themselves up. And this is how you get the Friedmans and Peter Abens and Deripaskas and all the other oligarchs today who are worth billions.
Well, and by the way, that's what Olga was saying. There is no private security business in Russia. There are no private military armies in Russia. This is absolutely impossible to imagine. Wagner Group is a good example of so-called parallel structures, which KGB was creating since the days of Andropov. And this is a form also creating a private army which would earn money beyond the control of the state, and that's what Wagner was doing in Africa, for example. So again, to think that those structures exist independently, it's a very naive approach. As we know, as Putin told us on 25th, I believe, of June, the next day after Prigozhin's march to Moscow, which never took place. He finally told us that Wagner Group actually was financed through the Russian budget on the level of billions of rubles. So this was a government structure, but again, since the government is now the FSB, or the FSB is now the government, this was the FSB structure, and this relates to whatever Serdyukov was doing as well. This could not be private, right? It's all under control. It's all under control, and this control again mainly belongs to the FSB.
And 30 seconds I want to add to that, just to show how geopolitically this is connected. The founder, quote unquote, on paper, Wagner was a lieutenant colonel from GRU. He came back from Syria after operating another private mercenary group in Syria, and Wagner was formed for the annexation of Crimea and occupation of Donbass. This was the purpose of Wagner, to have the plausible deniability that these are, little green men marching and not Russian military. And Wagner, when it was formed, the training base was in one of the elite units of GRU. And then you saw a lot of Wagner mercenaries, after go from Syria to Ukraine to Syria, back and forth, back and forth. And then at the full-scale invasion, they shifted a lot of them from Syria back to Ukraine.
I would just I would like to briefly suggest that I agree with Dr. Felshtinsky that KGB had a hand in Prigozhin's private army and has a hand in many other operations. But we shouldn't think, I believe, about KGB as about a state foundation any longer. They consider Russian budget, I believe, as their private sort of source of income, and there's kind of private armies they creating. They have a capacity and have a potential for becoming totally independent from the Moscow powers. And if the war in Ukraine continues in a way that Ukrainians will continue kind of taking parts of the Russian territories and disorganization will follow, maybe those kind of KGB funded armies, private armies, will behave in a completely sort of independent way. Look at Kadyrov. I mean, who depends on whom? Putin on Kadyrov or Kadyrov on Putin? It's becomes more and more complex, I believe, this question.
May I add? Just very briefly, so far the West is obliged to cooperate with FSB as for combating terrorism. But as far as I know, now there are also journalistic investigations on FSB possibly providing some protections to real terrorists. So if Russia is a mafia state and organized crime is protected by FSB, maybe they are also involved in some terrorist attacks. Here in France, the refugees, they are turning suddenly to radical Islamists and doing crime. So as far as I know, there are investigations, and I'm waiting for it also to raise awareness.
Well, I think after 7th of October, we have no doubt that the Russian state is assisting terrorism, right? Because they are helping openly to Hezbollah, Hamas, terrorists in Yemen. I think it's an open. And indeed, there was a interesting text by Dmitry Medvedev in his Telegram channel. There are a lot of interesting texts, but one of them was that we are now actually starting to support any movements which are trying to destabilize the world. So that's of course what they're doing, and that's what they plan to do. And unfortunately, I think we are just in the beginning of this particular program which the FSB has for us. As of ideology, I think again there were major changes since 21. So whatever, let's call it pre-war period. And I think Russia is moving further and further towards openly like fascist state with a fascist ideology, and the promotions which Dugin received recently, including being nominated as one of the leading professors of Moscow University, I think is indication towards this direction.
I'll answer the last question on what we can do. I think two things. One, the problem is that independent journalism is not funded adequately, and you have a lot of investigations, investigative journalists who are working on this. You need to prop up investigative journalists in Europe, in US, and basically for them to work together, because there's a lot of interconnections between Europe, US. You see the same players operating, whether it's via the far right or far left and whatnot. And also at the same time, US and European intel agencies need to step up revealing what they know, because their old way of thinking is to collect evidence and hold on, for decades. But now you've seen a sudden shift, like Department of Justice recently indicted a few people, involved with Russia Today for being propagandists via the far right, and making money from Russian state to spread propaganda and disinformation in U.S. That sent a shockwave, because now people in U.S. are worried, like, who else? Because the FBI did say in the DOJ indictment, 600 more people are under investigation. That sent a shockwave through people who are
Voiceover
working.
on 2:04 p.m.
Who are working
Top
for
of screen.
oh,
Stay. Try again.
for who are working for or peddling disinformation narratives for foreign intelligence services. And at the same time, Europe has also stepped up, wrapping up these spy nests, and basically immediately they see it, they arrest them. So I think it needs to be a combination, because the only way to solve this is transparency. The more transparency there is of where money's coming, laws need to be put in place. I know U.S. has started enacting some laws that you can't just buy billions of dollars in real estate without, through shell companies with no original owner. So the more transparency, the better.
Let me add just one word to it. I think it would be extremely important, in addition to what Olga just said, to make sure that there are different voices in the American and European media speaking about Russia, because the message is so kind of monolith and uniform. It's kind of depressing to see how the media kind of rehearse the same article from one to another, adding just little bits and pieces, but without kind of changing the substance, changing the picture. And the complicity of American, especially journalists, in what's going on should be a topic under investigation.
Donald, we wrap up the.
Yeah, let's wrap up.
Yeah.
Fascinating discussion, as many people have said in the comments. Sergio, you want to say some final words? You're the host.
Oh, I just want to thank the panelists and the audience for a very interesting discussion that on a topic that is is discussed very little. So we hope in the future to continue this kind of event. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And all the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And don't be surprised if people in the audience write you email questions. Every presentation was fascinating, and thank you from DC here across the ocean.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks again to everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.